Hello and welcome to the second part of this video about weathering the Lancia Delta 16 valve that debuted at the Sanremo Rally in 1989. In the first part, I covered the efforts to understand more about how pigments work, how to layer them, how to apply them on the wheels and the underbody, how to seal the underbody, how to ruin the work with the wrong coat, as you can probably see here. Furthermore, I also started playing around with one of the animal effects called dark mud that rendered a lot of the efforts and the final result more credible and overall more interesting. If you haven't seen the first part yet, make sure to head over my channel and check it out. It might or not appear as an overlay, depending if I am capable of doing that. In this video, I will be weathering the rest of the body and assemble the whole things together. The body has been previously prepared, painted with the right colors and with all the decals applied. I then sealed everything with a nice gloss coat on top. Windows, review mirrors and lights have been installed and glued as if this was going to be ready for final assembly. I won't close it yet, although this might be something I could do, but I find it easier to handle it. As we've seen in the previous video, the plan is to replicate the dusting that we can see in this photo that was taken during the Sanremo Rally in 1989. It's mostly made of two layers, a light in color, dry and dusty layer with a very thin and dried out splashes, and a thicker, muddier and darker one that is found in a smaller area, mostly where the wheel splashes would have reached. While I have prepared a plaster and pigment mixture, I also thought of trying dusting the pigment as is on the surface to see how much it will stick, effectively doing what's normally called dry brushing, a technique that is widely used over military vehicles. Hypothetically, this solution could help me achieve the final effect without too much hassle, effectively shortening the whole process. In practice, this doesn't work. As you can see, the surface is so smooth that the pigment won't stick to it. I then proceed to add water to the light mixture I had initially prepared and start brushing it on the lower area of the body without too much attention. This is meant to be feathered with some light splashes on the sides and covered partially with the dark mud as well. With the splashes, I can now try to blend the edges of the previously painted area to give a more realistic look to it. As you might have noticed, I also decided to give more coverage to the base layer. As I compared the result with the original image, I noticed that the base layer resulted way too light and transparent compared to the final result. I needed to have something much more opaque. As I finished the process of splattering, I noticed some drops of pigments have reached the inside of the car. I needed to pay more attention here. Adding some paper cloth on the inside should help me avoid having to mess things up, and potentially risking to contaminate areas that shouldn't. I am realizing that a lot of this work, for as much as chaotic can look like, it's about precision and the ability to contain the effects to specific areas. With a few more concentrated splashes, I reach out the underside of the side mirrors, and then, With a thin brush, I also decided to paint some of the trims in very specific areas that would have been exposed to the dust and splashes. At this point, likely due to tiredness and working late on this, I made the mistake of moving forward with the dark earth pigment. This, as I learned in the first part of the video, wouldn't have been the right decision to continue on with, since upon drying it would leave a very matte look that wouldn't particularly match the wet mud effect that I'm seeking. As I'm speeding through this part, I want to underline that this must have cost me at least a good hour of work, an error that I would have loved to have avoided. Upon drying, I came to the realization that nothing is to be thrown away. But it might be better to seal off this part and move on with the rest of the body. Nothing is lost, and the mistake might be recovered. After sealing the left-hand side of the body, and now clear about the plan for the rest of it, I start covering the bottom part of the rear and the right hand side with a diluted light pigment. I do not pay much attention on how well this is, but it's going to be the base that I will use for the splattering effect. One of the cool things that is possible with a gloss clear coat is being able to remove excess pigments without leaving too much trace behind. In this case, I prefer to keep the rear a bit more constrained, as I currently have no real understanding on how much the back will be dusted versus splattered. I will have to do a bit of search on the archive videos of the Lancia, as to my current research I have seen no photos of the back in this state. While I'm waiting for this layer to dry, as I did on the other side, I've taken out a thin brush and used it to retouch those tiny areas that are really difficult to reach, like those around some of the trims, the door handles and the underside of the rear mirror. I am overall satisfied with the work done so far, and while I don't know yet how I'm going to sort out the left hand side of the body, I have to say that this tiny splattering effect is working out great to replicate gravity, direction of the splatters and controlling the overall spread. I am particularly excited to have reached this point. I can finally seal the pigment layer and move forward. It almost feels like I'm halfway through. And for the occasion I am using a semi-gloss coat. I've noticed that when sprayed not too heavily over a base that is originally matte, as it is in this instance with the pigment, it will retain a lot of its original properties and will just slightly dull a shiny surface. I unfortunately noticed that a lot of the opaqueness of the pigment layer seems to be lost as soon as I started coating it. I will have to remedy that. The only explanation I have to that is probably because the first initial layer used a pigment solution that was too diluted. Last but not least, I'm also ready to lose the see-through of the rear window, but will try to mask as much as possible the side ones. After a bit more digging, I found some videos that reinforce the idea of the dusting of the initial layer and the back of the car. Dry brushing the existing surface will allow me to have a bit more control on how opaque the layer will look like, and, as you can see, with the semi-gloss layer it will stick on it very well. This, unfortunately, means that I have to be extra careful, as a slip of my hand might cost me dearly. In order to make things even, I finally dry brush the left hand side, feathering the initial layer a bit more. Now it's time to do the right hand side with the correct approach, using the dark mud enamel effect. This won't take long, and at the end I will need to use some thin detailing brush to cover some of the areas that I didn't reach and highlight some others. After a lot of sweating and swearing, I managed to put the car together without breaking almost anything. At this point, all I have to do is deal with the mud effect, starting from the back of the car. It will be very limited and concentrated on the rear bumper near the wheels. As I am here, I also decide to invigorate the left-hand side of the car, covering the initial mistake done. I decide to use a thin brush to do that, as I can still use the underneath dark layer and all I need is to make it look wet. I realized that I missed out a few small details on the kit: the engine under tray, if that's the right word for it, and the mudguards. The first was left out as I needed to have the space to access the engine bay to lock in the body when closing it. I could have done it when I did the underside of the car, but it looks like this is now the right moment. As for the mudguards, these weren't part of the kit. Since this build was meant to be a double build, I stole, so to speak, the photo-etched mudguards that came with the other kit from Hasegawa, since they were more appropriate for a dirt version of the car, while I used some more flexible ones to be used rolled up for the tarmac version. If you're curious, I left a link in the description to the project on ScaleMates. Both the under tray and the mudguards will require a different approach in order to weather them appropriately. The approach is almost the same. After doing some chipping effect on the under tray, I am preparing the light pigment as usual. I will use it to give an initial light coverage on both the under tray and the mudguards. I realize the under tray is way too covered and decide to buff it out with a dry brush. Once I was done with that, I tried applying the dark mud without splattering, rather painting it directly. The solution wasn't the best and looked too heavy and unnatural. What I ended up doing was cleaning the under tray with a cloth, and while this looked more like a desperate move, it gave it a look that I overall appreciated. Now I can move into blending everything together. I start by splattering the mudguards as much as possible from the inside, making sure to also hit the wheel arches and the underside of the car. I then moved to do the external part of the mudguards, which would likely be less dirty compared to the inside. I have to put a lot more attention for this part, as there's the risk of affecting larger areas that do not necessarily need this treatment. As I am done with the mudguards, I think this could be considered done. But I wanted to do something to take it to the next level, and perhaps risking it a bit, now that I'm feeling a bit more confident with the technique. The enamel effect does not bear a lot of substance once it reaches the surface, and it lays pretty flat on it. I want to see if it is possible at all to give it more thickness, the same way as I was experimenting with the dark pigment. I then decided to probably create a monster by adding some plaster to the enamel mixture. I have no idea this is the right way to maintain the wet look, but with more depth. If you have any better idea, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your experience. As I'm done with the preparation, I use a brush to deposit it on specific areas, on the inside of the mudguards, under the wheel arches, and in some areas that are likely to be hit by thick lumps of mud lifted by the wheels. I finish off everything with some further splattering to get some more of this on the side of the car. If you got to this point, I hope you enjoyed the whole process. And if you did, please like and subscribe and leave a comment if you have any questions or general suggestions. Thank you and see you next time.